in and around 1924, Gramsci and Togliatti and a number of other of his friends essentially based on the Turin group, which in turn had been based on the newspaper, the Ordine Nuovo, the New Order, and the people basing themselves on the Turin working class, became the leadership, the new leadership of the Italian Communist Party. In the meantime, he had gone to Moscow, to the International, where he had in fact married. He came back to Italy, and in 1926 he was arrested and spent the remainder of his life in a fascist jail, where he died. He had only one stroke of luck. When he went into jail, his friend Sraffa, who by this time had got out of Italy and in fact eventually settled in Cambridge, where he spent the rest of his life, Sraffa, who came from a relatively well-off family, opened an open account for him with the Milan bookshop, which enabled him to order books and periodicals, so that he would be able to read inside jail. He was not allowed to write for another 2 or 3 years by the fascist jailers, but thanks to the ability to read and to order books, and thanks to maintaining a slight contact with the outside world through his sister-in-law Tatiana and through Sraffa, he was able to concentrate. In between 1929 and 1934, he read and he wrote in a feverish manner, everything that he possibly could, and it is this, essentially, it is on these writings that his reputation is today based. Even in jail, he wasn't lucky. He found himself out of sympathy with the line of the Communist International in what was its most sectarian and suicidal phase, the so-called third period, and was consequently, even in jail for a time, he was isolated by the loyal comrades who believed that at all costs the international, the official line must be preserved. Nevertheless, as my initial anecdote shows you, it did not mean that the important leaders of the Italian movement in fact failed to appreciate him and to learn from him. And in the last 2 or 3 years, he was too ill even to write, and he died in March 1937, and this is the real occasion for celebrating, as it were, commemorating the 50 years after his death. So much then for the background. Now, this background accounts for a number of peculiarities in Gramsci's situation which are relevant to the interest and the value of his thinking as a politician. In the first place, he was an intellectual from a desperately poor and backward background, unlike most intellectuals in communist parties who came from middle-class backgrounds and joined the movement. It's very important that the background of coming from really dark, backward, impoverished villages in a really in the lost corners of a really lost island, to giving him a sense, if you like, of the problems, a real lived sense of the problems of poverty. Secondly, he was one of the few Marxists who were both theorists and leaders of a mass party. That's to say, whose theory was based on practical experience as a leader of a major party and not of a small and illegal group or sect. Marx and Engels had no such political experience, they could not have had. The main leaders of the Second International who had such experience were rarely theorists. In the Second International there was a curious pigeonhole for people called theorists, which was filled most notably by Karl Kautsky. Everybody listened to them, but in actual fact they were not actually doing the organizing and the mobilizing. And this is not a criticism, it's simply to show that there was a difference. The people who did the main organizing, people like Bebel or the old Liebknecht or Victor Adler and the others, were politicians, but not necessarily tremendously learned in the theory or original theorists. The Russians before 1917 had only a small illegal cadre party, and consequently their experience of actually running a major labor movement, except at the rarest moments, was inevitably limited. And of course the communist parties after 1920 outside the Soviet Union tended, I believe quite mistakenly, to assimilate the functions of leadership and theorist. And the leader became the theorist, and consequently you get all sorts of things like multi-volume editions of the speeches and articles of somebody like Maurice Thorez, of which the more important had been ghosted anyway by advisors, on the assumption that anything that the official leader says must be of major theoretical interest, which isn't quite the same thing. However, in the case of Gramsci, we do have an example of a man with a very fine and original theoretical brain who, at the same time, knew what actually the problem of organizing a mass movement for a mass revolutionary party, a mass proletarian movement is about. Thirdly, I'm afraid, he was one of the few of the such theorist leaders who had the leisure for theoretical reflection and was not constantly involved, plunged into the day-by-day politics, which of course most active leaders are. And that was because he was unlucky enough to be in jail for 10 years. I mean, he couldn't actually do what he would have had to do if he'd have been outside. And this, in a sense, means that he was able to look at things in a slightly longer perspective. And fourthly, and this is perhaps a bit more controversial, he was not formed in the classic mode of Marxism as it developed in the Second International, and in which even the Bolsheviks were formed, must be said. He came out of it quite differently. He came to Marxism, as a matter of fact, via the Russian Revolution. Before then, he was rather against it because he thought it was a sort of economic determinist thing. It did not allow sufficient road for human action. He didn't know enough about it at that time, but this was undoubtedly what people could very likely conclude. And it was only through the Russian Revolution, where the revolutionary element in Marxism had been preserved, that, as it were, Western European Marxist revolutionaries once again, from being mostly before the First World War syndicalists or semi-anarchists, began to rediscover that here was a revolutionary rather than a social democratic tradition, as they said. So, in a sense, he came without, as it were, his own approach to Marxism was a different one, and he didn't have to dismantle a large amount of traditional, so to speak, Kautsky accretions on the thought of Marx before he could start thinking. There are enormous arguments about how far he is a Leninist or not. Anyway, he thought he was a Leninist, and he thought it was Lenin who had, in fact, inspired his kind of Marxism. But one point is clear. He had one, if you like, advantage for us over Lenin. Lenin was unquestionably an enormously original Marxist in the 20th century, and never hesitated to change his analysis when he saw that the actual situation required it, that it wasn't any good keeping on the old formula, except that for reasons which I won't go into, which one could speculate, Lenin invariably believed, or at least talked as though what his innovations were entirely compatible with the literal truth of every text of Marx or of his predecessors. Indeed, up to about 1912, even of Kautsky. So he's a combination of officially utter orthodoxy, including textual orthodoxy went before, but in fact, if you actually go into it, tremendous originality. Now, Gramsci didn't actually believe that he had to make his thinking compatible with whatever Marx or Engels or somebody else had written in 1867 or 19.